Hi, my name is Darius.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Ethan. We will be doing our business case analysis on UFC, or the Ultimate Fighting Champion. Today, for our agenda, we will go over the problem and opportunity that the UFC has been presented, strategic outcomes of previous strategies they've implemented. Then we're going to be doing an analysis, a SWOT analysis, a Porter's 5 Forces analysis, and a PESTEL analysis. Then we will go over the relevant company details, an evaluation of alternatives, and then our recommended action. The UFC was founded in 1993 and has changed hands numerous times throughout its lifespan. Currently, it is owned by Dana White, and he has been posed with a certain set of possibilities that he could take the company. So his opportunity that he's been presented with is that he has possible new markets in China, India, and South Korea. Each of these markets pose different strategical challenges, and the UFC is equipped to deal with some, but not necessarily all, in its current state. Historically, the UFC has used local companies to enter new markets. They've also done things such as acquiring companies and then using their relationships with sports networks or other like promotional groups to influence those markets. It's been relatively successful, and the UFC has just had success in Australia. The unique problems to these countries are that China has a very severe political atmosphere. There's a lot of bureaucracy that goes on, and you have to know how to deal with those problems before you go into that market, because if you don't, then you're just going to get taken out of that market very quickly. The major problem in India is that there's not a lot of exposure for the UFC. As such, it's a very large market, but they don't even know what the product really is. And in South Korea, they have a very high uncertainty avoidance. They tend not to go with things that they don't already know work, and as such, are less inclined to go with new forms of entertainment. The competitive environment. There are a lot of pre-existing competitors in these markets. For the most part, none of them are major organizations. So in all three of these countries, they have long-standing traditional martial arts. In China, there's Kung Fu and Sanda. In India, there's Kushti and WWE. And in South Korea, we have Taekwondo, Hapkido, and several other smaller traditional martial arts. The main issue with this is that those markets are already set for those particular sports, and UFC kind of takes all of those sports together under one umbrella. In China's case, they had Yao Ming become a basketball sensation, and that allowed basketball to flourish in China. In India, they had the Great Khali, who was a WWE fighter, and that allowed WWE to flourish in India. And then the UFC already has Chan Sung Jung and Dong Hyun Kim in South Korea as members of the UFC. So they already have a foot in the door in South Korea. The UFC has also traditionally taken over potential competitors. They've purchased WEC, Strikeforce, and Pride FC in varying countries, and that again has allowed them to enter those markets. One of the major issues in the competitive market for UFC is going to be its historical brand image, as previously it was thought to be a very violent and unsanctioned activity, even in the US, not even considered a sport at one point in time. Strategic outcomes. So historically, the UFC has just simply bought out competitors. This has given them new market opportunities and local connections. It's been a massive success in most of the places that they've done this. They've also attempted to expand into diverse ethical demographics. They do this by using social icons of those ethnicities, such as 50 Cent, and then using their influence in order to garner respect in those communities. They also tend to try and get representation in the league for varying different ethnicities. So they don't have very high bars or anything that would socially prevent anyone of any ethnicity from joining the league. Another part of their strategy of promoting themselves is their pre-match events. They have pay-per-view pre-match fights so that when people are just scrolling through channels, they'll see a fight going on and then they might purchase the pay-per-view after they watch that fight. They've commercialized their weigh-ins so that it gets more of a community behind each of the fighters. And they did a similar thing on social media where the fighters will either tweet or post on varying social media platforms what they're doing, who they're fighting, to try and get all of the community behind the fighters that they support.
So for the SWOT analysis, there are your strengths. They have a wide roster of popular fighters contracted, ownership over Japan's Pride Fighting Championship and their corresponding library of MMA content, and ownership of Strikeforce, which reduces their domestic competition and expands the roster of fighters even further. They have multiple streams of revenue, both their merchandise and pay-per-view programs. They also have Flash Entertainment, who owns a 10% stake in UFC, allowing them easier expansion into the Middle East and Asia. Weaknesses. They have a fractured organizational structure, as acquisitions are not cleanly placed in a UFC organizational structure or branding. An example of this being Pride Fighting Championship, which had its own managerial structure. We also have Dana White, who is considered a part of the UFC's brand, which creates a risk for if he quits or dies. They have a constant need to churn in new fighters, along with a connection to the government of the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, which may lead to restrictions of what type of content can be created. Their opportunities are untapped markets with developing interest in MMA fighting, such as India or South Korea, wide potential audience appeal, including multiple ethnicities and ages. They also act as a potential middleman for their fighters building influence in other countries and becoming popular brand icons. As China also becomes wealthier, its citizens begin to demand more luxury Western goods, and the UFC may be able to position itself as such. And they have strong merchandise sales. Threats to the UFC include risks of regulations changing that could stifle or provide roadblocks for their expansion into other countries. Risk of foreign countries creating their own version of the UFC, whether that be state-run systems through either China to defend their cultural aspects or other similar sports. The pandemic also may present a roadblock for the UFC by slowing down live sessions and reducing the amount of events that they can host. The decline in traditional TV viewership also presents a potential long-term threat for the UFC in their pay-per-view model. Porter's Five Forces. Competition in the industry. There are a variety of competitors within the industry, with competitors varying from market to market, and they tend to act only in their home country. Of the competitors within the industry, the UFC appears to be the dominant one. They have a tendency to buy up their competitors and have cornered the US market. This is to an extent that they are being accused of being a monopoly. The UFC does have some actions in other countries, such as Japan, but so far has not established a significant or overwhelming presence in other nations, which are likely to receive them well. This may provide opportunities for the competitors to gain ground and entrench themselves within their respective markets. The competition in the industry is low to medium. The potential threat of new entrants. As MMA becomes more popular within other nations, there is a tendency for new competitors to develop. The cost to enter the industry, while not low, is decreasing rapidly as technology improves. Television isn't the only way to sell a fight, and that provides opportunities for new entrants into the industry. There are still high costs of licensing, insuring, and promoting such fights, but the overall costs to start up are lower than they would have been. The UFC has shown the way how to structure an MMA entertainment business, and this reduces the risks for new entrants and increases the speed at which they can become profitable. The threat of new entrants is high. Then we have power of suppliers. Within the industry, there are few suppliers who hold much power. The arenas that are used in fights can be interchanged to some degree. The suppliers for equipment such as gloves, shorts, or medical equipment can be interchanged without any significant reduction in the quality of the show. The fighters do have some sway, as they may become beloved personalities. Networks hold strong sway, as the refusal to host a pay-per-view fight would amount to significant losses for the competitor within the industry. The power of supplier being medium. Then we have the power of customers. Watching an MMA fight isn't necessarily essential. There are a wide variety of alternative blood sports to watch, and there is a choice to pirate pay-per-view fights or stream old fights altogether. This means that if the industry wants to make money, they have to give the audience a reason to watch their specific pay-per-view from a paid source. If the fight is boring, the audience will go elsewhere. If the fight is too expensive or paying for it doesn't provide much benefit, while piracy is easy, then they won't pay at all. The power of customers is high. And then we have the threat of substitutes. There's a significant threat of substitute products. There are a number of blood sports that are readily available to be watched. These include sports such as American football, boxing, etc. These sports may easily hold the target audience's watch time if the target audience loses interest in whatever MMA fights are going on at the time. With this in mind, it is imperative that new and exciting fights are continually being promoted and broadcasted in the lowest effort possible. The threat of substitute products will be high. So now we're going to be doing our pestle. So for political, the US has regulated MMA fights in the past. But through new regulations, this has allowed MMA fights to be fought and broadcasted to a wider audience. The political attitude towards MMA fights is mostly neutral now. In regards to China, China has a one-party system that has preferences towards domestic countries and therefore may interfere with the UFC's attempt to enter the market. The difference in copyright laws between various countries may also provide issue for copyright protection and eliminating the piracy of pay-per-view streams. In terms of economic, many countries are in the economic rise, which creates new and expanding middle classes who may be looking to find Western or interesting forms of entertainment. Large levels of inflation in the US and many other nations may have caused a reduction in the buying power of lower-income individuals. Hard economic times brought on by the pandemic have also caused a reduction in the total amount of disposable income that people have. This may cause issues with justifying the cost of pay-per-view fights. In terms of social, in many non-Western countries, traditional fighting forms and competitions hold a high level of social acceptance. That means that foreign countries may be keener to adopt an interest in MMA fights. Chinese resistance, though, may be slightly stronger, as perceived Western influence could be a potential roadblock for expansion into China. MMA could also be considered a competitor to traditional Chinese arts and thus hostile towards the preservation of Chinese culture. Indian culture already has a strong openness to new concepts with pre-existing appreciation for wrestling. It may be easier to bridge the cultural and style gap from wrestling to MMA as compared to other sports. In terms of technological, new technology makes streaming easier than ever. This allows for new avenues for audiences to watch pay-per-view fights, as well as new monetization strategies. In India, phones are frequently used, which may lead to an increase of popularity in short-form content. With the advent of numerous streaming services, a new wave of piracy has taken place, and piracy of entertainment is now easier than ever. Then we have the legal. US regulations initially prevented the UFC from expanding into their states, but as the sport has cleaned up various rules, regulations have steadily declined, along with increase in popularity of the brand due to the TV show The Ultimate Fighter. These regulations have largely been removed. India has less strict regulations as well, allowing for the potential expansion of new businesses, including the UFC, with less resistance as compared to other nations. Though there is a concern that with relaxed regulation has caused a death in South Korea on the MMA scene, which has caused fighters to refuse to fight due to non-payment and the cancellation of the event where this occurred. This may lead to increasing pressure to have tighter regulations for UFC fights in the future in South Korea, which could provide a potential slow to their growth. So for financials, the current financial situation. The UFC was bleeding up to $40 million in 2004, but has since turned their business around. They sold an estimated 5 million pay-per-view tickets in 2008. This leads to a potential estimate, based on previous figures, that they had made over $224,750,000 of estimated revenue. This shows significant turnaround and a potential bright future for the UFC. Potential countries to expand to. There are 3 primary candidates for expansion with significant financial opportunity: China, India, and South Korea. China has a growing middle class with 1.3 billion citizens, which presents an appealing market for UFC to expand into, along with the fact that the middle class has been demanding Western goods. This provides a potential opportunity to use their growing disposable income. India also has a rapidly growing GDP, with an 8.6% growth in 2010 and a population of over 1 billion. Both nations lack fighters in the UFC, which presents an opportunity for adding either Chinese or Indian fighters, which may be able to help improve the UFC's representation in these nations. South Korea has also had substantial Western funding from the US, with a $10 million deal added to increase US exports, allowing for greater influence from Western-style companies, which presents an opportunity for the UFC.
Current product, service, and market strategies. The UFC employs a product marketing scheme whereby they use video games, actual like clothing and sports gear merchandise, and they also have bought and currently run several gyms. They do this so that they can promote the brand of UFC even outside of the channels that most people would go to look for mixed martial arts fighting. If you're in the video game market, then you can appeal to people that likely will never willingly just search up MMA. If you're in just social gatherings as pieces of merchandise, then people might ask what the UFC is, or have questions, or even show interest to the company. And then the gyms promote MMA style workouts and things like that, that again build this kind of community around MMA and specifically the UFC. They use a multi-service approach. They use pay-per-view, live events, and even social media to promote their fights, as well as to actually deliver them to consumers. The UFC also has a tendency to purchase foreign companies over domestic companies that compete with them. And the reason for this is because it gives them an edge in foreign markets. Pride FC used to be a Japanese company, and UFC acquired it, and in doing so, it allowed them to expand into the Japanese market, which is typically very difficult to do for foreign companies. Strikeforce and WEC gave the UFC access to TV networks that allowed them to both promote and actually sell the pay-per-view purchases in varying foreign markets that they otherwise would not have had access to. The proposed market strategy is going to be a little different based off of which country. So there are some things that would work in all 3 of the countries. A national integration of participants is likely one of the easiest ways the UFC can move into the different foreign markets. As stated previously, they've done this already, and it's turned out very well. When they integrate people from different nationalities, the countries tend to have a sort of patriotism towards that fighter, and as such, they get much higher views in the local markets. They should partner with pre-established companies or networks. This allows them to have an actual conversation with potential partners about the cultural implications and other factors that just buying a company may not actually give them. And they should also be aware of the cultural importance of the industry in the varying countries. In China, it's very traditional. In India, the wrestling dates back 2,000 years. And in South Korea, they have so many different smaller schools of mixed martial arts that the culture is actually integrated into itself, which is very important for the company, especially that they don't step into that domain where they start insulting the culture by accident. In China specifically, they need to exert a lot of patience. They already have a contract with Sohu, which has given them exposure in China. China tends to take a very long time on business relations, and as such, it might just be a good idea to wait until more opportunities present themselves in China using that relationship. Another major issue in China is if they view a business as a cultural threat or a threat to the way that they run their country. So the UFC has to make sure that it's very open about the fact that it's not trying to change Chinese culture and it's not trying to do anything political. It's just a form of entertainment. In India, I think it would be a good idea to use a fighting evolution marketing campaign because the wrestling has been around in India and a very popular sport in India for so long. It's gone through very many, if different iterations of the actual sport, and as such, you could market using that, which might tie into the cultural background that fighting has in India. And then another major thing in India is being different from competitors. They already have WWE there that's pretty popular. The UFC has to show that it's different and also worth time to watch. In South Korea, I think the UFC would benefit a lot from live events, as they are a very large seller for the UFC and make up a large portion of its income. They also get a lot of fans to go to those events that may not have purchased pay-per-view because it's local and they want to see people in their own area participating in these fights. And then the other thing is South Korea doesn't like things that aren't certain, and as such, the UFC should only imply things that they know work. So their marketing strategies that they've done in other foreign markets that have shown success should be the ones they employ in South Korea, because taking risks would give the company a bad image in South Korea.
Now I'm just gonna kind of wrap everything together in the case and key success factors. So first things first is the firm structure, where you can kind of see it throughout the case. It is a functional hierarchy system, though it is more functional than divisional. So that would mean each department or set team would be more focused in a specific function. For example, handling the fighters or handling the marketing or whatever it is that's happening. You can actually reflect this onto its current team in present day, where they also do the exact same thing. And this also helps to promote organic management, which is suitable for an ever-changing industry, for example, UFC itself, as it is very much about gauging customer interest and getting able to keep them coming and potentially get even more viewers and more customers into their service, which is their pay-per-view event, which is their primary revenue driver. Onto management. From this case, we know that Dana White is the president of UFC, and the most prominent of the two brothers is Lorenzo Ferrita, and they are the indirect CEO of UFC at the time, as they're the CEO of Zuffa, which is the parent company for UFC. Next, we have a look at the people. How this is connected is, as both Josh and Ethan mentioned, is through contracts and UFC representation in other countries. With more of this and more martial arts from different countries going into UFC or taking an interest in UFC, they come over to UFC and they bolster the customers who want to view it and bolster the, I guess, more cultural, more mixed fashion of the martial arts that UFC kind of displays and shows for its customers. Lastly is the products and services, and I'm going to bring up an exhibit from the case itself here, which is the UFC brand control. Now, a lot of its products and services go into this wheel where it's attracting, it is converting customers, getting them immersed, extending that time frame in which they're kind of immersed, and then going back to attracting, and this entire cycle goes round and round. So going through with listing a couple of the things that they offer, the products and services. Obviously, for a very first thing we look at is their pay-per-view television. And this is their main stage, this is their main product, which they sell, and they have it displayed in multiple countries, and a lot of them, whether it's UFC 97 or some other season of it or round of it, it's been fairly popular ever since the Ferretta brothers made UFC into what it is today. Next, we can look at the TV programs and open broadcasts which aren't pay-per-view, which they also have. For example, The Ultimate Fighter, which looks at the Ultimate Fighter or the champions of UFC before, during, and after their rounds in the octagon, or UFC Countdown to really hype up a pay-per-view event that's coming up. Another one is their acquisitions also help to generate them more money. For example, Strike Force, even though it's mainly independent and it's been left kind of to do its own thing, it still generates revenue for them, and they can reinvest that into either Strike Force or their UFC program. Pride FC they also acquired, in which they kind of integrated into UFC, into its low weight category. And the best of Pride FC, which is taking Pride FC's kind of catalog of martial arts and kind of putting it out there for, I guess, more attention and more revenue, honestly. Next is UFC Disputed, which is their game, as Ethan mentioned. This is also another revenue driver and also included in the brand control, where they always change the mats, as they said, on the floor, saying to advertise their pay-per-view events. Next is UFC merchandise. This includes clothing, sporting goods, action figures, and these also contribute to their revenue, as well as increasing their brand awareness and getting other people involved, whether it's children or older adults, veterans, people who all have some invested interest, with, especially with the brothers advertising to everyone, even though their average customer age or viewer age is closer to early teens to middle-aged. Next, we have the UFC MMA gyms, in which they also help to promote MMA, which is mixed martial arts, if you didn't know already. And it also promotes UFC as a whole, as mixed martial art is their basis for UFC, after all. And lastly is UFC Magazine, which is another mechanism to get a little money on the side while also increasing brand awareness. Next, we're going to look at alternatives, and this will look at two things, which are going to be the two extremes, and then we're going to look at two other ones which are a bit more reasonable in terms of the brothers', I guess, management style, and also just in a realistic sense of thinking through the problem and opportunities. So first thing we're going to look at is a postponed alternative. Now, this would be the paranoid and cautious approach, in which UFC doesn't enter any new markets, so they don't go to China, they don't go to India, and they don't go to South Korea, but they go on to develop their current market and try to solidify their hold there, potentially enlarging their market share in those current markets, and then irregularly keeping up with the potential markets for open consideration in the future. So in this case, UFC again wouldn't go into a new market. They would kind of stay in their own place. Next is the more impatient alternative, in which again it's just they become impatient or aggressive. And here they would tackle or penetrate into all three potential markets: China, India, South Korea. And this would be done on the basis of only necessary preliminary information. So a little bit of culture, a little bit of the market there, and the competitors, and so on and so forth. And from there, they would try to get into the market. And from there, they would try to develop their market share and develop their awareness. So this would involve hasty market development, launching further market investigation once they are in the market. And this kind of highlights in the case about leveraging shared common traits, and whether or not they are common enough to be able to penetrate all of them, that's another concern entirely. But these are the two extreme alternatives that we've considered. Now, one of the more realistic approaches is what we call the safe alternative, which is reaching out to existing markets. So we're reaching into India and South Korea, and we're doing thorough market research, market development alongside it. So here we're reaching into these two markets because India has a large prospective MMA market due to generated interest according to the case, and South Korea already has existing UFC representation and a smaller prospective MMA market. And also, you have to consider that they are also a little bit inflexible, as Ethan has mentioned. Another detail is that the thorough market research would be going into each industry, would entail going into each market after thorough market research or other preparations. So for example, for India, further expanding that MMA awareness and potentially hyping up an idea of UFC coming to India, and just building out that awareness and marketing in that sense. Maybe even potentially putting some open broadcast programs into India to kind of build that hype. And then in South Korea, you would want to do more market research into the MMA events that had difficulties and older market segments because of their history in martial arts. You might want to investigate that and be able to grasp that audience in a larger light. Next, we have the ongoing alternative, and this would be a more ongoing basis, a continuous investigation approach involving pausing active international expansion and focusing on thorough market research. Now, this could be considered a close alternative to a postponed alternative, where instead of immediately jumping onto a potentially sinking ship, they would take on those same ideas in trying to approach India and South Korea. And in China, they would have to build out a lot more alternatives, a lot of different options, because they'll have to do market penetration, they'll have to find market partners, build that trust as per Chinese traditions, and develop a market position stability because of the bureaucracy and political environment of China when they are in the market. And those two factors, and just being patient with it, as China would be their, I guess, last potential market they would probably pursue. So exercising that patience. Yeah, so in this case, it'd be an ongoing reach into each market at a respective time. So in this case, in terms of how much reach we have into each market so far, it would be South Korea, India, then China. Next, we're going to talk about the recommended action. Here, we're going to be considering which alternative to put our action plan into. And what we chose was the safe alternative. So in this case, we'd be taking advantage. In our first step, we would be taking advantage of South Korea representation because UFC already has some UFC representatives that are from South Korea, and we would go through that and go to South Korea, kind of vocalizing the interest in further exposure in South Korea, while doing further investigation into, again, those two key components of martial arts in South Korea. So the MMA event difficulties and connecting with MMA or martial arts traditions there. And that would be a smaller focus versus focusing on investigating MMA in India, because it is a large market, as large as China, as we know nowadays, as India and China are kind of both in a very high growth state. So this would be our primary focus. And then our third step would be penetrating and reaching into both of those markets in a respective ready time. So this would be most likely South Korea before India, just because of how much exposure we already have in South Korea. Lastly, I'll kind of propose another idea, which is that the brothers could potentially think of focusing primarily on a South Korea campaign before an India campaign, just to be very thorough and make sure that their plans can go through and they're accommodating to their cultures and martial arts there or fighting in those respective countries and markets. And that's about it. Thank you for your attention, and we hope that our case analysis could help you.